The night is torn open, first by a sound, then by a light. An ambulance siren screams through the silence, its flashing red lights painting haunting streaks of color across the sleeping streets. A police car arrives, and a strip of yellow tape is stretched across the scene, sharp and cold like a cut that severs reality in two. Then, a voice begins to speak, low and heavy, like the strike of a judge's gavel in the court of public opinion. The voice tells of how, in just a few short seconds, a gunshot stole the life of Charlie Kirk. To many, he was just a controversial name on television. But to those who knew him, he was a husband, a son, a friend. Tonight, that name is no longer a topic for debate. It has become a mournful milestone, carved into a nation being suffocated by the specter of political violence. The scene shifts, pulling us into a series of bleak, stark images. A pair of shoes abandoned in a spreading pool of blood. A single bullet, carefully collected by a white-gloved hand. And then, a vicious torrent of overlapping tweets cascades down the screen, half in mourning, half in mockery. In an instant, we are pulled into the eye of a storm, where death is no longer the end, but the raw material for a war of words. The narrator's voice returns, this time colder, sharper. It explains that this was not just a murder. It is a mirror reflecting ourselves, a society where a person's death is immediately turned into ammunition in an ideological war. The physical violence took place. And immediately after, verbal violence followed, like a wildfire spreading from flesh and blood to language itself. The sound intensifies, the posts flashing like lightning. A comment from Keith Olbermann appears, cold and cruel, almost celebrating the death. It's followed by a tweet from Matt Walsh, furious, offering unforgiving retaliation. Every word, every sentence is more fuel for the raging fire. Amidst this digital storm, the frame slowly pulls back, settling on a place that is familiar, yet tonight feels alien. The desk of last week tonight. Tonight, the lighting is different. It is cold and harsh, casting a courtroom-like glare over the studio, stripping away all its usual warmth. John Oliver sits there, silent, his trademark smile gone. And then, behind him, blazing red letters burn onto the screen. When words become weapons, the narrator speaks one last time like a final indictment. This is not just the story of an assassination. It is the story of a nation spiraling into a vortex of hatred. A place where violence is no longer confined to the barrel of a gun. It lives in our words, in our text, in the way we see each other as the enemy. The lighting in the studio slowly adjusts. It's no longer the warm glow usually seen on entertainment shows. It carries a cold silver hue, sweeping across the faces in the audience. On the giant LED screen behind the desk, the image of the assassination remains a looping news clip. An ambulance speeding through the night, a police officer bending to collect evidence, the incessant wail of sirens. John Oliver sits upright behind his familiar desk. But today, the desk is not for hosting. It feels like a witness stand in a public trial. The overhead lights cast hard shadows on his face, making him look sterner, like a prosecutor about to deliver his opening statement. The audience sits in rows, unusually silent. Some faces are tense. Others glance around as if unsure whether this is still the political comedy show they know, or if it has transformed into a hearing. There is no laughter, no whistling, only the soft creak of chairs and a few heavy breaths echoing in the space. In the center of the stage, an empty chair waits. It sits opposite John Oliver, positioned directly in the spotlight, with nowhere to hide. It is the seat for the guest tonight. That guest is Matt Walsh, a figure accustomed to the noise of controversy, but rarely one to sit on a stage set like a public inquisition. The camera pans in for a close-up, a microphone on the desk, the Last Week Tonight logo, and a red button in front of Oliver, which will control the clips, tweets, and data he has prepared. The scene is an arsenal of images, where each press of the button will unleash a piece of incriminating evidence. Suddenly, the show's familiar theme music begins. But tonight, it's not cheerful. It has been remixed with a driving, percussive beat, like the sound of a military march. The studio instantly transforms into a symbolic battlefield. The audience is the jury, John Oliver is the prosecutor, and Matt Walsh is about to enter as the unofficial defendant. The light focuses on the entrance. A door opens. A figure appears to restrained applause. Matt Walsh walks out, his gait steady, his expression cold, as if ready for a battle of wits. He approaches the empty chair, shakes Oliver's hand in the direct glare of the spotlight, and sits down. The air in the studio is as taut as a bowstring. This is no longer a typical guest welcome. This is the moment the curtain falls on political theater, and everyone in the audience can feel it. This conversation will not be easy. As Matt Walsh settled into his chair, the studio remained utterly silent. John Oliver attempted to start with a polite smile, though the corners of his mouth seemed more strained than relaxed. "Matt, thank you for being here," Oliver began, his voice laced with its usual hint of sarcasm. "I know with your schedule, getting the two of us in the same room is no small feat." A few small, timid laughs rippled through the audience, as if they were trying to find comfort in the thick, tense atmosphere. Matt Walsh gave a slight nod, his voice flat and emotionless in response. "These conversations are necessary," he said, "even when both sides completely disagree." Oliver tilted his head in mock agreement, but his eyes were sharp, as if searching for an opening. He shifted slightly toward Walsh, lowered his voice, and began his introduction. "Matt, you are one of the most controversial figures in conservative media. Some call you unflinching, others say cruel. But regardless of one's opinion, no one can deny that the name Walsh is enough to ignite a firestorm of debate." Then he asked a seemingly gentle question: "Does being at the center of that constant controversy make you comfortable?" Walsh raised an eyebrow, but his face remained a cold mask. "It's a good sign," he answered without hesitation. "If my work only made people nod in agreement, I would be nothing more than a bland commentator. Controversy is necessary because it forces people to think." Oliver folded his arms, nodding, a sarcastic smirk playing on his lips. "Well, you must be spectacularly successful. Then, because it seems no one can scroll through Twitter without stumbling into a war of words centered around you." The joke landed, and this time, the laughter from the studio was louder, a release after minutes of stifling tension. Walsh, however, remained stone-faced, unmoved. Oliver leaned forward, his tone losing its lightness. He brought up the documentaries Walsh had made, especially the provocative film on the subject of gender. In it, Walsh had made sharp, even shocking arguments. Oliver looked him directly in the eye and asked, "Was that shock the goal, or merely a consequence?" Walsh placed a hand on the armrest of his chair. "I don't seek shock," he replied firmly. "I seek truth. And if that truth shocks people, that is their problem, not mine." The studio fell silent. John Oliver narrowed his eyes, his lips pressed together. The initial pleasantries were over. The atmosphere shifted, growing heavier, signaling that the conversation was about to enter a dangerous territory, where every word would become a blade cutting deeper into society's fractures. A silence fell over the studio. Oliver narrowed his eyes, his lips pursed as he prepared for the abrupt shift in topic. The initial banter was merely a prelude, and both the audience and Walsh could feel it. The dialogue was about to enter the danger zone. Oliver turned his full attention to Walsh, his voice dropping, each word precise. "You say you're only seeking truth. But don't you see how the way you present that truth with harsh, scathing, sometimes deeply sarcastic language turns it into a weapon? In a society that is already so divided, don't you think that approach is just adding fuel to the fire?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. Walsh leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. He answered immediately, without hesitation. "Truth is sometimes painful, but hiding it is far more dangerous," he said. "It is the hypersensitivity, the idea that every frank word is violence, that has made society weaker. Asking tough questions isn't sowing hatred, it's paving the way for clarity." Oliver listened, but he did not relent. He slowly placed his hand on the red button in front of him, signaling to the audience that a piece of evidence was about to appear. The studio lights shifted, becoming colder, more intense. The audience understood that Oliver was ready to steer the conversation down a much thornier path. In that moment, the real confrontation began. The polite questions were over. Now, every sentence would be an arrow, every nod a trap, and the entire studio was a string pulled to its breaking point, waiting to snap. John Oliver pressed the button. In an instant, the screen behind him lit up. A tweet appeared, magnified so large that the audience could read every word. It was Keith Olbermann's post, crude, vitriolic, almost cheering at the death of Charlie Kirk. "Burn in hell, Sinclair." Along with Charlie Kirk, the studio audibly gasped. A few audience members uttered exclamations, and whispers spread like a wave. Oliver didn't speak immediately. He let the image hang there for a few seconds, like evidence presented before a court. Then he turned to Walsh, his voice low and colder than before. "Do you see this, Matt? A man has just lost his life, and only hours later, another man is publicly celebrating on social media. Is this what we call dialogue now?" Walsh sat motionless, but a flicker of contempt crossed his eyes. Olbermann crossed a line of basic humanity. He said, his voice hard as stone, "To celebrate any person's death, no matter who they are, is a depraved, inhuman act." Oliver listened, nodding slightly, but he didn't let Walsh stop there. He pressed the button again. The screen changed. This time, it was Walsh's own reply, where he directly attacked Olbermann, mocking his age, his unemployment, and his lonely life. Oliver let the audience read it all, then slowly turned back. "And this is your response. A personal, vicious counterattack. You didn't just rebut Olbermann's words, you attacked his private life. So, Matt, where is the difference?" The audience stirred, some nodding in agreement, others falling silent, waiting to see how Walsh would react. The air in the room grew thick, as if the oxygen itself had slowed. Walsh leaned forward slightly, his eyes burning with defiance. "The difference," he replied, "was clear. Olbermann rejoiced in a man's death. I merely exposed the truth about a hypocrite." Oliver was relentless. He leaned over the desk, his voice like clashing metal. "But don't you realize that both of you, in one way or another, turned a personal tragedy into a weapon to attack an opponent? Is that the kind of dialogue you say we need?" The audience was completely silent. No more whispers, no more shifting in their seats. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Walsh sat still, his breathing heavier, ready to throw his next verbal punch. And in that moment, everyone knew. The tension had just reached a new level. The air in the studio was as compressed as a pressure cooker. John Oliver's words hung in the air, pushing Matt Walsh to the brink of a counteroffensive. And Walsh did not back down. He held his head high, his voice sharp and ringing, stripped of its earlier calm. "Olbermann's words were unforgivable," Walsh declared. "To celebrate a man's death, no matter who he is depravity. When someone turns tragedy into a moment of glee, we cannot stand by. I do not apologize for calling him a pathetic man. It is the truth, and I would say it again if I had to." The audience was split. Some people clapped in support, the applause sparse but firm. But immediately, whistles of protest erupted from another corner of the studio. The already tense atmosphere exploded into two opposing poles. John Oliver looked around, then turned back to Walsh. He didn't interrupt, but his gaze grew sterner, as if to challenge him further. "Matt," he said slowly, "I am not denying that Olbermann crossed a line. But when you respond by attacking his personal life, aren't you playing the same game? Aren't you also turning a man's death into an excuse to fire back?" Walsh tapped his hand lightly on the armrest, not in uncontrolled anger, but for emphasis. "No," he replied. "I did not celebrate death. I did not turn a corpse into a banner. I simply reminded the world that a man filled with such hatred, with no career, no family, no faith, is already living in his own hell, even while he breathes. I said it because I refuse to be silent in the face of evil." The response hit a wall of silence. An audience member in the front row began to cry, covering her mouth, while another man stood up to protest before being pulled back down. The entire room had become a battlefield, not just between the two men on stage, but among those who were witnessing it. Oliver leaned forward, his eyes flashing, his voice now as stern as a judge's bell. "But Matt, it is that retaliation, the way you weaponize your outrage, that allows this cycle of hatred to continue. Don't you see? This isn't a debate anymore. This is a war of words." Walsh did not retreat. He stared directly at Oliver, his eyes blazing with defiance. An invisible space opened between them, like a chasm widening by the second. And the audience knew. This was only the beginning of a clash that was about to become far more brutal. The studio lights dimmed, leaving the two men facing each other in a single harsh spotlight. John Oliver gripped his note card, but instead of looking down, he stared at Matt Walsh, as if turning his next question into a public indictment. He pressed the button. The screen behind him instantly changed, displaying Walsh's tweet, the reply to Olbermann that the audience had glimpsed earlier. The white text on a black background was magnified, revealing every caustic phrase. Keith, you're already living in hell. Old, unemployed, with no one by your side. I'd rather be dead than live your life. Without Oliver needing to say another word, the audience began to murmur. A few people gasped, others shook their heads. The image hung in the air like a blade. Oliver let it sit for a few seconds, allowing the weight of the words to permeate the atmosphere before he spoke. Matt, you yourself said you only seek truth. But look at this. This isn't truth. This is a curse, a personal attack, a humiliation. You have criticized the other side for politicizing death. Yet here, you are doing the exact same thing. You are taking a tragedy and turning it into a tool to shoot back, to demean an opponent. So, where is the difference? Can you tell me and this audience why this act is more righteous than the very thing you claim to despise? The accusation landed like a hammer blow. Walsh sat bolt upright, his hands clenched into fists, his face taut. He opened his mouth to reply, but Oliver held up a hand to stop him, pressing his advantage. You cannot condemn political violence while feeding it with your own words. Every sentence like this, Matt, is kindling. And when we are living in a country where guns are going off in the streets, can you really say that your words aren't making the fuse burn faster? The audience fell completely silent. No more murmurs. No more shifting chairs. Only the heavy stillness of a room watching a man being backed into a corner. Walsh took a long, deep breath. His eyes lit up, not with fear, but with defiance. He knew this was no longer a conversation. This was a public trial, and he had just officially become the defendant. Matt Walsh sat motionless for a few seconds, as if weighing silence against an explosion. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but resonant, every word laced with steel. He stated that he did not celebrate Charlie Kirk's death, nor did he exploit it. He was merely responding to someone who had crossed the limits of humanity. To him, that wasn't verbal violence. It was a bitter truth people are afraid to confront. A mixed roar went up from the audience. A few people applauded in support, while others shook their heads violently. The polarization was no longer just on stage. It had spilled into the seats. Oliver remained seated, calm but with an expression as sharp as a scalpel, not letting the defense pass unchallenged. He tilted his head, his voice hardening. You call it a bitter truth. But Matt, have you ever asked yourself when the truth is delivered like a dagger, is it still truth or has it become a weapon? You say you are fighting evil, but your very method of response recreates that evil. How are you any different from Olbermann, when you both turn death into a tool? The question was a needle aimed at the most painful point. Walsh's brow furrowed, and he shifted slightly, a flash of anger in his eyes. He answered definitively that the difference was this. He did not proactively cheer for death, he only unmasked hypocrisy. If he remained silent, he argued, that cruelty would be normalized, and he would never allow that. In that instant, the room felt like it was shaking. One audience member yelled, "That's right," while from the opposite side, someone shouted, "You're just as vicious as they are." The wave of conflict from the crowd crashed back onto the stage, turning the dialogue into a clear battle line. Oliver seized the moment, his voice becoming more insistent, more powerful. You say you won't be silent, but has it ever occurred to you that your voice, the way you wrap it in contempt and scorn, is fueling the very violence you claim to be fighting? How is that any different from throwing more wood on a fire while claiming you're trying to put it out? Walsh breathed heavily, his hands tightening. If the fire is already burning, he shot back, his voice like ice. The solution is not to sit back and wait for it to die. The solution is to point directly at the arsonist, and I will not apologize for doing that. In that moment, the studio exploded with tension. This was no longer an interview. This was the turning point, where two men had cast aside all pretense of civility to reveal the raw nature of an unforgiving confrontation. The atmosphere in the studio erupted like an uncontrollable fire. Shouts and applause clashed, as if the audience itself had been swept into the ideological war the two men represented. John Oliver sat upright, his face stern, his eyes glinting like a scalpel. Matt Walsh leaned slightly forward, his hands on the desk, like a boxer ready to land a decisive blow. Oliver was the first to break through the chaos. His voice was urgent, each word an arrow aimed at his opponent. Matt, look at this audience. Look at society out there. Every death, every tragedy, is turned into a weapon. People no longer grieve. They just look for a reason to hate. And you, with your millions of followers, are adding fuel to that fire. Can you deny it? Walsh didn't blink. I deny it, he shot back, his voice firm. I am not adding fuel. I am simply pointing out that the fire is already here, and it is people like Olbermann who lit the match. I did not create this division, John. I just refuse to pretend it doesn't exist. The audience roared with a mix of applause and boos. Oliver tapped his hand lightly on the desk, refusing to lose control. You say you didn't create the division, he pressed, but your words turn opponents into enemies and debate into war. When you say, I'd rather be dead than live his life, you aren't just attacking Olbermann. You are sending a message that people have no value if they are not like you, and that right there is the root of violence. The statement landed like a verdict. The audience fell silent. Walsh's lips tightened, his eyes darkened, and then he erupted. His voice thundered through the studio. No, John. I did not say his life has no value. I said that hatred has destroyed that life. And if we don't point that out, that hatred will continue to spread. You want to be silent in the face of evil. I will not. I will name it. I will expose it. That is not violence. That is a necessity. Their voices collided, like thunderclaps in the same sky. The camera panned across the audience, tense faces, a few people holding their heads in their hands, others glaring at each other with fury. The studio had become a mirror of the society outside, divided, half in praise, half in outrage, and all caught in a whirlwind of hate. This was the climax. No more masks, no more holding back. Just two men, two ideologies, in a direct confrontation, and an entire nation seemed to be holding its breath, watching every word. As the final fiery words of the debate faded, the studio descended into an unprecedented state of chaos. Half the audience erupted in fervent applause, as if witnessing a victory. The other half booed and hissed, so angry that some leaped to their feet, shouting words the microphones couldn't catch. The atmosphere was like a volatile sports match, but instead of a field, this was an arena of words and ideologies. John Oliver sat still, but his eyes couldn't hide the tension. He knew what had just happened was no longer a conversation. It was a great fracture, exposed before millions of television viewers. Matt Walsh, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, his expression cold, as if satisfied with the storm he had helped create. Some audience members began to leave. A camera caught a middle-aged woman shaking her head, her eyes welling with tears, whispering that she came for reason, not to witness more hate. Meanwhile, a group of young men in the upper rows chanted Walsh's name, as if he were a warrior who had just defended their truth. On social media, clips from the show went viral instantly. Within minutes, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok were flooded with hashtags, Walsh exposed, Oliver owned, political violence. Each side edited and shared the moments that favored them, launching them like missiles in a digital war. Some praised Walsh for daring to speak the truth, while others derided him as a hypocrite. Oliver wasn't spared either. Some lauded him as a voice of conscience, while others called him a ringmaster of a circus. Inside the studio, the noise from the crowd refused to die down. Stagehands signaled for order, but the polarization was too stark. This was no longer an entertainment show. It had become a microcosm of American society. Oliver sighed, placing his hands on the desk. He glanced at the red button one last time but didn't touch it. He knew any more clips would only escalate the tension. As for Walsh, he sat silently, a slight smirk playing on his lips. In the glare of the spotlight, that smile looked both confident and defiant, as if he believed he had achieved exactly what he wanted. A word that would become a deeper crack in the heart of the public. The immediate consequences of the confrontation were not confined to the stage. They spilled out of the studio doors, onto every phone screen, into every coffee shop debate, and every furious social media post. And it was all just beginning. The chaos in the auditorium finally subsided, not because the audience calmed down, but because John Oliver raised his hand, signaling for silence. The spotlight focused solely on him, his face projected clearly on the large screen, every line seeming to be etched deeper by the weight of what he was about to say. Oliver took a long breath. His voice was no longer urgent or sarcastic. Instead, it was heavy, carrying the tone of a final judgment. What did we just witness? A man is dead, a real, flesh-and-blood human being. But instead of pausing to mourn, to reflect, we see hatred given a new linguistic skin. Keith Olbermann turns death into a moment of glee. Matt Walsh responds with personal contempt. And while both sides throw their barbs back and forth, the painful truth remains. Political violence is escalating, and we are all helping to feed it. The room was silent. All eyes were on him. Oliver paused, letting that space hang in the air and sink into the viewers' minds, then continued, his voice sharp. The violence isn't just in the bullet that took Charlie Kirk's life. It's in every word, every tweet, every smirk when an opponent falls. If our words are gunpowder, then we are lighting the fuse every single day. And at some point, we can no longer pretend to be surprised when it explodes. Oliver leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. He was no longer speaking to Walsh. He was speaking to America, to the millions of people watching. We have the right to disagree. We have the right to debate. But when we turn our opponents into enemies, when we see death as an opportunity to score political points, then we have stepped out of the realm of democracy and into the realm of war. And this war, I fear, will have no winners. A thick silence enveloped the studio. The audience did not clap, nor did they boo. They just sat there, as if they had just heard an indictment against themselves. Oliver bowed his head, concluding his final thought. That is the verdict I leave you with tonight. Not for Matt Walsh, not for Keith Olbermann, but for all of us. The lights slowly faded, emphasizing the gravity of his words. A moment that was no longer comedy, no longer entertainment. This was a judgment, and it forced every single person to judge themselves. The studio lights continued to dim, leaving the two figures seated opposite each other in a narrow pool of light. The audience remained silent, not applauding, not cheering, as if pinned to their seats by the weight of what had just transpired. The camera panned slowly, capturing Matt Walsh's face. He sat there, back straight, eyes forward, lips slightly pursed. There was no smile, but no remorse either. Only the cold look of a man who believed he had done the right thing, regardless of the storm around him. The lens shifted to John Oliver. He said nothing more. He just sat quietly, his hands folded on the desk, his gaze fixed on the camera. The silence stretched for a few seconds, long enough that the studio audience began to stir, but Oliver remained still. It was a deliberate silence, a way of forcing the viewers at home to confront the emptiness left behind by a hurricane of words. On the screen behind them, the images from the top of the show repeated. The ambulance racing through the night, the yellow tape at the crime scene, the flashing tweets like embers against a black background. The driving music from the intro was gone, replaced by a slow, somber piano melody, like a farewell to a nation losing its ability to have a normal conversation. The camera made one final sweep of the room. Tense faces, red-rimmed eyes, looks of doubt and anger. No one was smiling. No one was entertained. The Last Week Tonight studio, a place that usually exploded with laughter and satire, now felt like a public court that had just concluded a heavy trial. Oliver let out a soft sigh, then finally gave a slight nod to the audience in the room, a silent thank you. The camera slowly zoomed out, the light receding, leaving the image of two men sitting in an ever-widening darkness, like two warriors after a battle with no victor. The screen faded to black. A single line of text appeared, red as a gash, when words become weapons. The piano melody held its last note, then faded completely. The audience in the real world sat still, while the audience at home remained stunned. Because the ending offered no release. It only left a lingering question. What happens next? When the violence no longer stops with a bullet, but has taken root in the very way people speak about each other. Immediately after the show ended, the studio doors opened, and the audience filed out in silence. The usual cheerful chatter after a last week tonight taping was gone. In its place were heavy footsteps and small, tense conversations. Some said they felt shaken, as if they had just been slapped in the face by reality. Others complained that the show had gone too far, that it was no longer political comedy but a public trial. On social media, the fallout from the dialogue spread rapidly, more powerfully than anything that had happened inside the studio. Minutes after it aired, clips from the heated debate were shared hundreds of thousands of times. One side posted the video of John Oliver indicting Walsh with the hashtag #OliverForTruth. The other side countered with the clip of Walsh declaring he would not apologize for naming evil with the hashtag #WalshSpeaksTruth. Two battle lines were clearly drawn, perfectly mirroring American society. On the news channels, hosts rushed to dissect the encounter. CNN called it a televised moment that exposed our toxic division. Fox News portrayed Walsh as a warrior who was cornered but refused to back down. Newspaper headlines were contradictory. Oliver sounds the alarm and Walsh unbowed by attack. Meanwhile, the family of the assassinated Charlie Kirk appeared in a short interview. They said what hurt them most was not just Charlie's death, but how it was immediately weaponized. His sister broke down in tears on camera. "He's been gone less than 2 days," she cried. "Why do we have to turn this pain into a game of hate?" Her words resonated, but they were quickly drowned out by the storm on social media. Images, hashtags, memes, commentary. It all merged into an inescapable vortex. The violence was no longer just bullets or curses in a studio. It had become the energy that flowed through every click, every typed word, every real-life conversation. And as night fell across America, the echo did not fade. Instead, it continued to smolder, like covered embers, just waiting for a gust of wind to erupt into a new fire. The echoes of the confrontation still hang heavy in the air as the screen shifts to the familiar template of a YouTube outro. But there is no upbeat music, no funny graphics. There is only a silent, black background. From the dim light, John Oliver's face appears. And when he speaks, his voice is slow, stripped of all its usual sarcasm. He tells us that we've just been through an uncomfortable conversation. That a man is dead, a society is fractured, and our words, instead of healing, are only pushing us further apart. He admits that he can't fix it, that Matt Walsh and Keith Olbermann can't either. But maybe, he says, his eyes finding the lens, you, the person listening right now, are the key. The camera begins a slow, deliberate zoom, pulling the viewer closer, making the address feel intensely personal, almost confrontational. He poses a challenge, a moment of self-reflection for everyone watching. Pause for a second before you share a hateful tweet. He urges, take a breath before you let emotion overwhelm reason. And ask yourself, am I contributing to the construction, or am I just throwing more fuel on the fire? His words are stern but carry the weight of a plea. As he speaks, large red letters materialize behind him on the screen, a stark and simple command. Don't turn tragedy into weaponry. We believe the audience of this channel isn't just made of passive viewers, but of people who demand the truth. If you believe that too, show it. Hit like to tell the algorithm that in-depth content matters, share to invite more minds into this discussion, and subscribe to build a community that refuses to accept shallow answers.